Hey, I'm talking today with Dusty Sharp. Dusty, how you doing, man?
Doing great. How you doing, Jim?
Pretty good, pretty good. Thanks for coming on your favorite thriller. Let me start things off by reading a little bit of your Amazon bio here. Dusty Sharp lives in Southern California with his wife, Stephanie, and three English Mastiffs. He enjoys exploring the backcountry of the desert Southwest and tinkering on old Ford Broncos. Dusty enjoys good cigars, better food, and great beer. He has had a lifelong interest in the history of California and the West and is a proud member of E. Clampus Vitus. His professional background is in marketing, having worked for many years in the RV and automotive aftermarket industries. The Austin Conrad thrillers are his first published works of fiction. Learn more about Dusty and his books at dustysharp.com. So, Dusty, E. Clampus Vitus, is that some super secret organization you are not allowed to tell anybody about?
No, it's really just a fraternity of guys that go out and we put up historical markers. You've probably seen them around, maybe not where you live, probably not Eclampus vitus markers, but out here in the West, a lot of the historical markers that you'll see around, what happened on this spot in 18 whatever. A lot of those are put up by Eclampus vitus, and it's a cool thing to do. We have a lot of fun doing it. Some people call it a historical drinking society, and others call it a drinking historical society.
Sure.
But we put up monuments, and we we have fun doing it. It's basically what we do. So
Interesting.
yeah.
So, tell us a little bit about you and your writing.
So I've been writing for, well, pretty much all my life as far as you know unprofessionally. But my I started writing books about almost 2 years ago, and I did it mostly to scratch an itch I had. And I've since I was a kid, I've always believed that I've been a huge reader. There's quite a few authors I follow from me. From since I was a little kid, I was a huge Stephen King fan, even before I was really old enough to read his books. I remember the librarian made me get a note from my mom the first time I wanted to check out Salem's Lot, because I was, I think I was like 9 years old. But I remember back then thinking, this is awesome. The storytelling is awesome, and thinking, I could do that. But it always seemed back then such, being a writer was such an elitist thing that you had to, I even back then I understood that you just don't become a writer. You have to, go through all of the business end of it. That was way before indie publishing, where you had to, get an agent or get a book deal, and that would take years. And you'd see these horror stories about rejection letters and everything. So I never really thought of it as something that I could do professionally. And then, as I grew older, I never had time for it as just a hobby. So, but I've always been, writing has always been part of my job. I work in marketing. I do a lot of technical writing, a lot of sales writing, a lot of copywriting for advertising and things like that. So, I've been able to sort of keep my hand in writing, but later in life, like I said a few years ago, I started thinking, I'd really, because I'd always been thinking, I bet one day I want to start writing books, and it occurred to me, well, the clock's ticking, I better start. So,
Mm-hmm.
so I did. Actually, the thing that really kind of got me in gear was I saw. I read somewhere that one of my favorite authors, we're not talking about him today, but Steve Barry, I read that he was 48 years old when he published his first book. And uh, and when I read that, it was just before my 48th birthday. And I said, you know what? I'm going to start writing books, and I'm going to publish also while I'm still 48. And I actually got my first two out during that year before I turned 49. So I made that goal, I figure look at Steve Barry now. He's one of the biggest thriller authors there is.
Nice.
So
So, Dusty, here's probably the most important question of the show. If your life was a reality show, what would it be called and what would it be about?
um, I would say the name of it would be Coffees for Grown-ups. And
Mm.
what it would be about is being in denial of of the passage of time. You know, getting older, and not that you fight it. It's just that you know you live as a younger person than you are always.
Mm.
You don't see yourself as how old you are. And as far as that title that I thought of is, it's funny because I never did drink coffee until about a year ago, and and I got my caffeine in other ways, but my wife is a big coffee drinker, and I used to tell her, coffee's for grown-ups.
Mm.
And, kind of just implying that I'm not a grown-up yet. I'm not, old enough to drink coffee, even though, at that point I was in my 40s. So, um, yeah, that's probably what I would call it.
Gotcha. You could also hold on to that title for when you publish your memoir. That'll be a good title for it.
Yeah, 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 that one of them. So,
So today we're talking about your favorite thriller, and the book you said you wanted to talk about is Livia Lone by Barry Eisler, which is an excellent book that I have also read. Can you give us like a spoiler-free synopsis or give us a little taste about what the book is about?
okay, so Livia Lone, for those who have read Barry Eisler, his main character for most of his books is a guy named John Rain, who's a trained assassin. He's great at what he does, and those are awesome books. But when Livia Lone came out, it was I was at first a little apprehensive. It's like is this going to be that Barry Eisler I love or something different? Well, it was it's a different character. It turns out later on that it's in the same universe, but it's a different character. And basically, it's this woman who works for the Seattle PD. She's a sex crimes investigator for the police department, um, and she lives sort of a double life, also as a vigilante who tracks down the bad guys that the cops can't get to for various reasons. Sort of like Dexter in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And the book Livia Lone, and it's the beginning of a series with her as the protagonist. The first book, Livia Lone, it goes through that in the present time, while also giving you flashbacks to her origin story. And her origin story is extremely interesting. She was a teenager, her and her sister, in Laos or Thailand, I believe, and in a small village, and she was abducted into human trafficking, sex trafficking, actually. And we learn later, and this isn't much of a spoiler, I don't think, but we learn later that her parents actually sold her into it. So it's terrible, terrible circumstances. So we follow her story, the journey through, across the ocean. She ends up in the United States, and she basically ends up as a slave, as a human slave for for an important guy, and it goes through her, what created her, how did she turn into this person, and her unique story. So what's great about that is a lot of these action heroes and thriller heroes, you know we know that, oh, they're a government agent or an ex military guy or whatever, but we don't really get into their heads of how they came about and why they are the way they are. But with Livia Lone, we do. There's a few twists and whatnot, so I won't give any spoilers, but it's a really good character study of her, and it's also just a cracking good read. It's fast paced. You've got these two parallel stories happening simultaneously, and Barry Eisler's his knack for keeping up that pace and the dialogue and the action and the violence too. I love the gritty stuff, and he does it better than just about anybody.
Would you describe the book as a page turner?
Of course, yeah. It's it's not a slow burn at all. It keeps you going. Um, it starts off with Livia in the present, where stalking one of her, one of her victims, and so you get that punch right, right in the beginning, and then it starts, feeding in uh, little tidbits of her past and whatnot. But it's never slow. Um, you always want to know what happens next, and Barry Eisler, he's a master at that.
And from what I remember in the flashback scenes, they were dark and compelling, and the kind of thing that it's hard to read because of what's happening.
Yeah,
It's hard to read because of the subject matter, but it's just so compelling that you can't look away.
yeah, and the it's a difficult subject, and he doesn't. Barry Eisler doesn't shy away from from the details of these crimes, right? So he describes them in detail, and for some people, well, even for me, it's pretty squeamish, right? I mean, some of these things are pretty hard to take,
Hmm.
but 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 that lends itself to the realism of what's going on. It gives it weight, right? Um, to sort of dance around those subjects, it wouldn't have as much impact as it does with the way he describes it. So,
Right.
um, as some people who read it might get turned off and by how detailed he gets in some of the violence scenes and sex scenes, but you know, I mean, you come away from it not you don't look at it salaciously. You look at it as basically a documentary showing you how horrific this is,
Yeah.
and the whole subject of human trafficking, sex slavery. It gives it weight. It makes it more than just a backdrop of the story.
Do you think does the book have a theme that you took away from it?
Um, Typical of thrillers, there's not a lot of nuance. You know, as far as theme, I think the theme is really just how evil people can be, and how it sometimes it takes evil measures to bring them to justice. Maybe
Yeah.
not evil measures, but you have to pretty much get as you have to roll around in the dirt with them. You have to use their tactics,
Yeah.
and it's not clean when you have to combat some of these things. There's no way to do it with white gloves. And
Yeah.
um, but I think as far as the overall theme, there's actually more theme that sort of gets established as her story moves on beyond this book. And now I think it's in the third book, fourth if you count the Killer Collective, which he wrote with all of his characters in that universe. But she starts, this is her origin story. Livia Lone, the book is, but moving forward, there's a theme of how damaged she is from from her childhood and her upbringing, and her experience at the hands of this evil, and it leaves her. I mean, it prepares her for what she's doing now. As far as she learned how to take care of herself. She learned self-defense. She learned uh, martial arts and weapons use, and she's pretty much a badass. That can take care of herself, but she's damaged inside. She's very fragile, and we see that more so in the following books than we do in this one. And that kind of turns into a theme that that we can follow throughout her story arc.
Have you read all the Livia Lone books?
Yes, yes, and there's a brand new one getting ready to come out. I'm looking forward
Wow.
to it.
I have the Killer Collective, but I haven't read it yet. The TBR list is on the Kindle. There's just like only like 6 or 8,000 other books I have to read to first before I can get to the Killer Collective.
Yeah, there's a couple of authors that for me, their books move to the top of the TBR.
Sure, sure.
They don't slot in wherever they, it's not first come first served, but
So Barry Eisler's one of those authors for you?
of course, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I wouldn't say I know him, but we're Facebook friends, and he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm Facebook friends with him too. I did that I think a few years ago before he was as famous.
You knew
So,
him before he was big time. So,
well, I didn't actually know him. He just, random guy Facebook friended him, and I guess he said, "What the hell?"
so what else? Who are your other favorite thriller authors?
Um, I have I have quite a few, but I love them for different reasons. Like Lee Child is also one of those who doesn't have to wait in my TBR list. I
Mm-hmm.
read his whatever comes out, and his books are sometimes there's I think they're in the 20s now of how many of the Jack Reacher books he has, and you know they're not always as good as the previous ones, or you know what I mean. Sometimes they're better than others, right? And every once in a while you'll read one, that wasn't as good, but he's he what he's great at that I love is his depiction of action. His choreograph of fight scenes and what's going through through Jack Reacher's head as things are happening. I really love that. So, and that's one of the things I've tried to emulate in my own books. So I love him for that. For another thriller author I really like is Steve Berry. I've mentioned him already. He I love that sort of Da Vinci Code type aspect of his books, where it's a modern thriller but based on historical things going on. And I have plans to write some of those type of books in the future. I haven't yet, but I really love those books. I love, I know our mutual friends Nick and Ernest Dempsey and Kevin Tumlinson. They're pretty big in that genre too.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say those three are my top three thriller authors. I would say probably Mark Dawson too.
Mm-hmm.
I read his, pretty much as soon as they come out. Sometimes I have to wait a little bit on those. He puts them out a little quicker than I can get to.
With Lee Child, it's pretty amazing that he's built this 20-plus year career writing one character, and that's basically all he's ever written.
One character and one book a year.
Yeah.
And it's on a strict schedule.
And I don't want to dwell on writing craft, but I read that he writes one draft and then he's done. He like takes 6 months off and then spends 6 months writing one draft and then he's done. He doesn't touch it again.
It makes you wonder how good that draft is.
Because, I guess if you know the character well enough and you've been doing it for 20 years, maybe he doesn't need another draft.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know.
I mean, a lot of these, I've heard of some of the big time authors who, are using ghostwriters and whatnot. I'm not saying he does it, but it could be the case that his first drafts are so bare bones that a lot of the flesh gets put in by the editors or whoever. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm wondering if that's the case.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Dusty, what book of yours do you want to talk about today?
Well, being a fairly new guy, I don't have much to choose from, so I'll say my third book, Blood Out. It's the third book in a series, the Austin Conrad series. It has elements in it that are inspired by several of the authors we've talked about today. One of the my protagonist is he's an ex-outlaw biker, and when I started writing these books, there's sort of an origin story behind it of where that character came from. But the reason I turned an ex-outlaw biker into an action hero and a thriller hero is because I kind of got tired of all these thriller protagonists who were secret government agents or, ex-military Navy SEALs and whatnot. I kind of wanted a little bit more of an everyman. And, but I like the Jack Reacher, kind of nomadic type thing. So, he's a biker, there's a big tough guy, and because of that, he has a checkered past, right? Also, he's done some bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So in these books, the three first books I've written so far, they kind of tell the story of his exit from his motorcycle club, and it gets pretty violent and pretty action packed. And the third book, Blood Out, is where it really comes to a head. And I don't want to give away too much, but there's a lot of themes that I cover in it. As some of the stuff we've talked about today is, like getting old, because he's an old guy in the books, right? He's about 49, almost 50, and over the hill by a lot of standards, especially action hero guys. But he's still able to kick ass, and it's set in Southern California, an area I'm familiar with, so that made it a little easier to write than if I placed it someplace else. And it's getting great reviews. So readers are welcome to check that out. I'm sure you'll have a link. I also have the first book in the series is my free book. If people want to sign up and download that, they can from my website.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll put a link on YouTube and Facebook in the show notes down below. And if you're listening to the podcast, if you go to my website, there'll be a link to buy this book there in the show episode notes there too. Dusty, is there anything else that you want to talk about? Anything that I didn't ask you that you wish I would have asked you about Livia Lone or about Blood Out or about you?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. Yeah, I'm still a newish writer, and I'm not that far along in my career. I hope, hope readers will take a look at my work, and hopefully one of these days I'll be as far along as you are now. Of course, you'll be way ahead of me by then, and it's a fun journey, and I'm glad. And I've gotten to know you and all the great people that are indie authors in our thriller community. It's a great thing to be a part of.
Excellent, Dusty. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. That was Livia Lone and Blood Out, Austin Conrad thriller number 3. Thanks. Good to see you, Dusty.
All right. Thanks.